What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video we're going to continue with our custom widget card up here that will allow us to calculate the total for our trip. So in the last one we only did the layout, and this one will actually be communicating with Firebase to actually add saved amounts here. So if we click 25, you'll see it's updating in real time, and this is updated in Firebase as well. We're also going to be able to subtract, so if we want to remove money if we made a mistake, we can do that as well. One cool thing about this is that on this main page here, it is representative of this next trip that's coming up. So for instance, 140 is going to be the amount that's saved on this trip here. But if we go back and we go down to another trip, which is coming up, the Boston trip, for instance, you see we have $25 saved there, but that is different than they're two separate elements, but we're able to reuse that widget across both of them and essentially across all of our trips. All right, let's get started. All right, so the first thing we need to do is actually have a way to pass our next most upcoming trip into this calculator widget. So right now this calculator widget has no concept of what our next trip is. Currently there's just one trip here, so we will be passing the most recent based on the date, the next upcoming one. So the first thing we can do to get the calculator widget knowing what this trip is to allow this calculator widget to take a trip parameter. So if you remember, we have our trip model here, which this model just holds all the data for a trip. And just if anyone's kind of jumping in on this video, that relates to all the data in our Firestore database here. If you're kind of just jumping in on this video, you can go back through the channel and all of that is explained in previous videos. But anyway, so we want a way to pass this trip object into the calculator widget. So right here at the top, firstly, we're going to need to import that trip model. So under models, trip, we're importing that. And then here we can set that variable for the trip object, and we'll just call it the trip. And then we're going to instantiate this calculator widget with that trip, and we're going to make it required. So to have a required parameter, you can just call required, and then this dot trip is what will reference the trip that's passed in. We just need to, let's see, actually we need to put this in brackets and move that up here, and then format it that way and put a semicolon there. This actually needs a comma, not a semicolon. So like this. So now the calculator widget will be accepting a trip parameter. So go ahead to the home view where we do have our calculator widget, and we are going to try and get a trip. Or actually, firstly, let's have something printing out here so that we know the trip value when we get it. So right now this 800 saved, actually let's do the needed. The 200 needed will essentially be the same as our trips, that trip object that we pass in. It will be the trips actual amount per day, which is the 100. So that's actually going to be the budget. And this will need to be in brackets here. So the trip budget here, you'll see that does not work, but that's expected because we aren't actually passing in a trip to this. So if we go back to the home controller, and here is where we have our calculator widget. So this is going to need to be passing a trip into it. Now, the way we're getting our trips right now, and this is, I guess we would want to see this. The way we're getting our trips right now is we're listing them down here, and we have the stream builder, which will build them out right here. And we do make one call to Firebase, which is returning this this query snapshot. Now we don't necessarily want to get this most recent trip the same way. So we're going to actually create a new little function here that's just going to query for the most the most upcoming trip. So essentially like the next trip. Right now it's only New Zealand, so let me actually add a few more trips so we make sure we're getting the right one. All right, I added 3 trips here. So we have New York, Boston, and New Zealand. The dates are actually formatted kind of backwards, so I'm going to change that real quick and do month, day, then year. Then change that for both the start and end date here. All right, so you can see the order of these are 3/17, 3/29, and then 3/4. So these aren't even in order of the most upcoming trip. We can quickly change that by going into where we have our stream get users trip stream snapshot, and we can just add an order by here, and we'll order it by the start date. So now it's 3/4, 3/17, and 3/29. So it's in order of the start date. So we want a way to get this first card here and pass it into this calculator widget. So let's just create a whole new function for this, and we're going to call it the get next trip. And this is actually going to be an async function because it will be calling Firebase. And then we will need that user's ID because the way our data is structured, if you remember, this is the user's ID. So we need to go, basically we need to go to, or no, this will be the user's ID. So we need to go to the user data collection, then the user's ID document, then the trips collection, and then we need to go to that trip document that is basically next in line. So of these 3 that we have, we would actually be getting this New Zealand one, and that's only because March 4th is earlier than the other 2 dates. So this would essentially get our user ID if we had the context, which we'll have in a second, but then we're going to just make a call to get a snapshot, kind of similar to how we're getting this stream up here, but it is a little bit different. So here we're going to just define another variable called snapshot, and this will equal we're going to have to wait on this. This will be a Firestore instance. We'll call that first collection, which was the user data. Then we'll call the document, which is going to be the UID. And then we're going to call the collection of trips. Then we're going to call the same order by that we just did. So it will be that start date. Then we can actually limit this to just one result because we're only interested in one. And then once we have that limit, we can actually call get documents. And this will get us all the documents that match basically this query, which should just be the first with the earliest start date of the trips for this user. Now that we have that, we can actually return this snapshot. And we don't want to just return the snapshot. We want to get that first document. Even though there is always going to be one document, this is basically unwrapping the snapshot to get just that first document's data. And the reason for this is because we do have a function that we want this function rather to return the actual document's data, so then we can use that data to create a trip. So you'll see this context isn't working here. Now that actually needs to be all one line. So to get this context working, we actually need to be calling this within the context of our build method. So you might think we could just add this right in there, and you'd be wrong. That actually won't work. And the reason is because this is essentially a future builder function because of this asynchronous. So we need to make a call to actually get this data, which means we need to put this in a future builder. So this is kind of what we did with the stream builder, but I'm kind of now showing you another way to do this with a future builder. And it is different since we only have one piece of data, where the stream builder, we are building kind of a list of stuff. So that's kind of the different use cases. But we don't want to just put the future builder right here. I mean, we will put the future builder right here, but let me show you kind of the not exactly right way to do it, and then we'll fix it. So the future builder here would take 2 parameters. One is the future, and the future for us is actually going to be that function that we created down here. So this is the future that we want to call in the future builder. And then this line right here is what is going to cause us problems. So let's finish this out first and then fix that. So the builder here is the second name parameter that this takes, and you can put the context and the snapshot here because that is what it will be looking for. Now the builder has multiple different states. The only state that we're really interested in is when the connection state is equal to done, where at that point we'll have this data here. So let's do a quick if statement, and it'll be if the snapshot's connection state equals connection state of done. And you can see all these other states that are here that you can put logic in if you want for different things. We're not going to do that in this video, but yeah, if the connection state is done, then we can actually return that calculator widget. And within that, we can pass the parameters that, or we can pass that trip parameter, which is actually going to equal the snapshot's data. So snapshot data there, we can get rid of that and put a semicolon there. So the reason it's the snapshots data is because this function here is going to return this data. So essentially we're just saying whatever data, the snapshot represents this function's return value, and data is one part of that. So you can see like the connection state is one part of that, of the snapshot as well. So it's more than just the data returned from this. Hopefully that makes sense. We can add a quick else statement here as well, just to catch all those other connection states. And for now, we're just going to return a text field that says loading. All right, and that will need a comma there. That looks good. You'll see the context is still not quite working here. As I was saying, having this function here is going to cause some problems. Now, the reason for that is whenever your page is reloaded or things change on the page, this build function will be reloaded as well. So if we have the build function getting reloaded, it's going to rebuild this future, and that's gonna kind of cause some problems because the state of this widget will be rebuilt each time as well. Basically, to fix this problem though that you would have with it rebuilding it when you don't want it to be rebuilt is pretty simple. You just make this a stateful widget, meaning your home view would be converted to a stateful widget, and then you're going to just have this future be a stateful object, and then you're only really going to build it once. You're going to get the trip once, and then that will be held in a variable that holds state, and then we can put that variable in here. So let me just show you how to do this. It'll be I think make more sense after that. So we're going to define a future here, and it will be the next trip is what we're going to call it, and we can use the underscore. And actually, let's capitalize that trip there. All right, so the future of the next trip is there. We're going to get the init state here, and we're going to actually set that next trip value, and we're going to set it equal to the function here that we created, the get next trip. So basically, we're going to get this return value once, and we are going to then use this next trip in the future builder instead of actually calling the function. And that will actually give the context now to this get next trip because it's part of the initialized widget. All right, so you can see this error here. Document snapshot is not of subtype trip. That's because we're not actually passing a trip here. This snapshot data is not a trip object. If you go down here, the snapshot is actually a document object. So we do have a function in our trip object here that will convert a snapshot, actually a document snapshot, into a trip. So let's go ahead and use this from snapshot. And going back into the home here, we can, I suppose, do it right in this function here. And we would say that this will return a trip now, and it'll be a trip from a snapshot. And then we're going to pass it that snapshot right here. And now if you save this and run it, you'll see needed is still there, but that's because I commented out where we had the actual budget. So now if you save it, you'll see it is the 100 of our budget right here. That means we have the next trip value being passed into our calculator widget. So now in our calculator widget, we can update it to actually use all the data from that next trip. So the first thing to do is actually, we don't want the trip budget here. We want actually a value that is the total value of the trip, which if you go back in here, you can see it. We're already calculating that on the trip detail page, the 700. So this must be a 7-day trip. So let's go ahead and use that function. If you go to the trip detail view, you can see we have a get total trip days function here. I'm going to refactor this a bit, and as well as the get days until trip, let's take both of these functions and actually copy them and comment them out here, and then go into our trip model and place them down at the bottom. This will allow us to use them on any trip. So go ahead and remove the widget.trip parts of this because we don't need it. Now we can reuse these functions a little bit more for all of our trips. So go back to the detailed trip view page and find where this function was being called. Just by highlighting it, you should be able to scroll up and see that. So here you were going to need to just call the widget.trip and then call that function, which is now defined over there. And this one is the same. And we should not have any errors there. If we go back in, everything looks fine, which is good. So we can actually also then delete this commented out area. Hopefully that's making sense. That's just a bit of refactoring, moving the code around. This is what is most interesting to us though, is this get total trip days, which is pretty much just getting the days between the start and end date. I mean, that's exactly what it's doing. So we can use that back in our calculator here and do just a quick calculation. So we have the trip budget, and then we want to just multiply that by the, going to call trip, and then we would call get trip total days. And now you'll see that does have the 700. We do want this to be also lowered to a int, so we can do that by wrapping all of this in parentheses and then call floor. That will get us down to just the integer value of it. The next thing we want to do is get that saved value and actually have a place to save this in. So in our trip model back in here, we're going to add a new field, and it's going to be actually a double, just very similar to our budget field here. You're going to do a double, and it will be called saved. So this is going to represent the amount of money that someone has saved for this trip. When we instantiate a trip, we actually are not going to set it, so this part can be left blank. This is formatted for uploading to Firebase when creating a trip, so we also don't need that to be, although I do feel like we can leave this one blank for now at least. Creating a trip object from a Firebase snapshot, we will update this to include the saved method, so saved will equal the snapshot and the value of saved. All right, that is the only, that's the only other spot we need it, so save that. Now that we have that save parameter on our trip, we can actually add it into one of these buttons on the on pressed and send a value for that to Firebase. And go ahead and make it async. And then we're going to need the user's ID again for this. So very similar to what we did in that home view where we have the UID here. Just go ahead and copy all of that or actually rather, let's do it as the one-liner, same code. We will get that UID. The provider is not in this widget, so we're going to need to import it. We're also going to need the Firebase or the Firestore, Cloud Firestore. So again, back down in this $25 button addition, we now have our UID, and then we can also get, or now we can create a Firebase instance with a wait again, and this instance will be just to update that Firebase object. So it's actually the Firestore instance, and then we can just go right into getting the collection. Now this is going to be very, very similar to what we did in this home view here, where we get the collection for the user data, UID, trips, and then we're not going to order or limit. So just copy these three parts of it, which would be like this. So it's that user data collection, the document of the user's ID, and then we're going to get that trips collection. And then we do know now, what the document is here, because our trip actually has the trip object that we're passing in here, this one right here up at the top, is going to have the document ID on it. So we can do the trip and just call document ID. And then now that we know what document we're updating, we can actually call update. So update data, and then the data we're going to update, and this is going to be as a dictionary hash, saved is going to be the data we're updating, and then we're going to update it to the value of 25, right? But not just 25. We want it to be the value that is already saved. So it'd be the trip value that's saved, and then we're going to add 25 to it. So this is actually going to cause some problems, because this would be, firstly, the trip value here is not existent, right? So this document doesn't currently have a saved value on it. So how you get around that is actually to set it to 0 if it doesn't exist. So if we call trip.save, there's this actual null operator in Flutter, which is just 2 question marks. And basically what this means is, if we write it like this, what this means is use the trip.saved value, and then if it's null, use this value. So in this case, for this document, it will use this value. The 25 will actually need to be a double at this point, because this is a double value, the saved value. But if you save this and run it, it looks like there is a bit of an error here, and we just need a semicolon there, and then we can run that. So now if you click this 25, you'll see pressed 25 pressed worked. If you go into the document here, you'll see saved 25 is actually saved to the database. So you'll notice neither of these numbers were updated, and we're going to go with the same kind of pattern that we've done in the past, which is we're going to update our data in Firebase, but we're also going to have this widget be stateful and update the value in our stateful widget as well. And that will prevent us from calling Firebase again. So because the alternative would be to basically reload this whole widget and call Firebase for these widget values. But this will save us one call to Firebase. So anyway, to achieve that, we need to convert our stateless widget here, which is the calculator, into a stateful widget. So once it's a stateful widget, we are going to set 2 new variables, and they will be they'll be integer values for both of them. Okay, so in our calculator state down here, right after the money controller, which is the text editing controller, we're going to set those 2 ints. One is going to be saved, and actually let's make this an underscore saved, and the other one will be the needed. And then we're going to initialize those states for both of those, and the the init state for saved is actually going to be equal to that saved value, which now that this is stateful, we have to call widget first, and then we can call trip, and then it's going to be that saved value. Again, we're going to do the null operator and convert it to 0 if that value doesn't exist, and then wrap this whole thing and call floor on it. So that will essentially convert this from a double to an int. And the reason we're wrapping it outside is because either way, if this is does have a value, it will be a double, and then we're setting this already as a double, and then we call floor on that. So either way, our saved value will now be an integer. The needed value is going to be kind of similar, but this is going to utilize our function that we already have down here to calculate the needed amount. So again, we can copy this whole piece here, including the floor element of it, and then we can put that right here. Now, really we want just the budget, and we can calculate that to the floor. So then that essentially makes this total budget, which is 100 for this one, would equal an int, and then we'll multiply that by the total number of days, and then we can remove this trip floor here. This is partially there, but actually we need to additionally wrap this in a parentheses here, and then we need to subtract the saved value from it. So this is going to, as it is right now, will always just give us the total that's needed, and then if we subtract the total that's been saved, we'll actually have this part right here is going to give us the total of the total trip cost, and then if we subtract the amount that's been saved, we'll actually have the total that's needed. So now that those are set, we can actually update in our code down here. We can remove this, and this will just be needed, and then the saved element will also be right here where we have 800. We can just add the saved element there, and that is throwing an error. If you just rerun the whole app, that error should go away. That has to do with when we converted it to being stateless, the hot reload doesn't always work like with that. All right, so now you can see that the 25 is here, but this is not loading in real time. So if you hit the 25 again here, this is not updated at all. So to update that, we are going to edit our raised button that we have for 25, and we're going to the first thing we're going to do actually is set the state of those elements. So call set state here, and the saved is going to change. And it's going to actually equal the saved element that it already was plus the $25 amount. So we can just add that there. And again, saved is an integer now, so we don't need to have that as a double. Needed is kind of similar. It's going to equal the needed amount, but then we're going to subtract $25 from it, or $25 from it. The rest of it will be the same, but we can save here instead of saving all of that information, which we're already kind of configuring. We can just give it the actual saved the saved variable there. So now if you save and rerun this, and again, the $25 button is the only one that is set up right now, you'll see it does update to 50 and subtract from there. So there is a bit of a problem with the rest of the app, and that is that type, the issue it's saying here is that type int is not a subtype of double. So that's because we're trying to save this int value, which actually needs to be a double. So call to double here. And basically that whole record is no longer good. So just go in here and in Firebase and delete that document, because basically the data in it is wrong. If you come back and reload it, since we deleted it, we now only have the 2 trips. So you'll see we're on our New York trip, which has nothing saved. If we add 25, you'll see the number is updated. 25 over here. If we hit it again, this should go down to 50. and it did. So now to set up these other two buttons, we don't want to rewrite all this code. We want to create this as a function and then just pass it in these values of 25, 50, and 100. So go ahead and copy this whole button out here, and down before the last end bracket, create a raised button function. So a function that will return a raised button. We'll call it get, or we'll call it generate add money function, or I guess button. And then the only thing that this should take is an integer for the amount, and then it will return that raised button. So now we can kind of just tweak this a little bit. Instead of having the text be 25, let's have the text be that amount. And then all the rest of that looks fine. Instead of using 25 here, use amount. And same with what we subtract. And that should be good. We are printing out what was pressed. Let's just delete that. We don't need it anymore. Now we can call this generate add money button with the amount. We can delete all three of these buttons here. And then for the amount, it will be 25. And then the second one is 50. And lastly, 100. So if you rerun that, you'll see 25 still works, 50 also works, and 100 also works. So these three buttons are all configured. The last thing we need to do is configure the custom amount so that you could enter any amount here and then save it. We could try and modify this function to work with that as well, but I think it's different enough that it's actually just going to be kind of a hassle. So we're going to just code it up, modify it basically by itself. So essentially what is in the onPressed will be what we're modifying. So go ahead and take what's in the onPressed and place it in the onPressed up here, which this raised button is that saved button here. And here's where things are going to change, because the amount is no longer going to be the amount will no longer be just a value, right? It's going to depend on what's in this money text field. So we do have the money controller.text is going to be the actual string value of the text that the user enters. So we need to parse this into an int, and int.parse is what we'll use for that. So basically adding the integer value that the user enters there, the same thing is going to work, or the same thing is going to happen right here. So that should be good. The awaits are not working because this onPressed needs to be asynchronous. And then everything should be okay. If you want to, you'll need to rerun it. If you want to, you could definitely try and work this into another function, or potentially even pull out a function here and combine them. That's your call though. So anyway, if we add 1, for instance, and hit save, you'll see 1 works, or any really custom number will work. Now, we also want the ability to do a negative number here, and the reason for that is because it'll kind of let people edit it however they want. So if you accidentally add 50 here, there's nothing you can do to subtract 50. So the easiest way, I think, to do this, and the most intuitive without making this too complex and having like an edit field of its own, is to just let this field do both positive and negative, and we'll do that with 2 separate buttons. So we'll have you can have this 10 here, and then you can add or you can subtract that amount. So basically how we're going to do this is we're going to change this raise button to be an icon button. Like that, and then instead of having the child here, we're going to actually set an icon, and that icon will be for the addition, which is what is currently set up. We'll use the add circle button. The color we're going to change to be the that cayenne color. There will be no text color, but we will change the size. The icon size will want to be about 50. Now if you save this, you'll see essentially it looks the same. Maybe we make this green. I don't know, don't want to get too caught up on the colors, but that would be that button. Then basically copy this whole thing and we're going to modify it. Instead of the add circle, we can have the remove circle, and this could be red, I suppose. And then the only thing we're going to change here is actually the sign of what is in between here. So if we are subtracting, we're going to remove from the saved and we're going to add to the needed. And that is it for that. So if you save this, you'll see we can add 6 or subtract 6 rather. So this should go up to 20 and this should go down to 80. And that looks good. We could add the 6 back and continue adding 6 at a time. Anything will work subtraction wise or addition wise this way. So one last thing I want to show you is that we can reuse this whole widget. For instance, in our page here, as well as in our other or any of our other trips. So the main thing that I want to show you is that this widget will very simply be able to calculate the difference between these two trips. Meaning that when you click on New York, you're going to see the data for New York, and when you click on Boston, you'll see the data for Boston. So, and always this one is just going to be the first trip or the next upcoming trip. To add this widget to your trip details page, go ahead and find basically what you're doing in the basically what you're doing here with the calculator widget. Copy that and go into the trip details or the detailed trip view page, and then wherever you want to add it in that list of the our main build function here, we have a just a sliver list here which has all these different elements, right? So if we want to put it right at the top, just put it at the top of the sliver list, and you'll see there are a few errors here. Firstly, the trip itself is already defined here. It's already defined in here as the trip, and since this is stateful, we're just gonna have to call widget dot trip, and the calculator widget is not defined here, so we just need to import that, and this is under our widgets and calculator widget. So if you save that, oh, okay, so this needs to have a comma here, and then if you save that, you'll see right at the top, and actually let's put it the second to the top so we have that New York title above it. If you save this though, you'll see our New York one is 250 and 350, and if you go back and you go into our Boston one, you'll see $0 are saved for this trip, and the needed is much lower as well. If we save $25 here, all is good, and we can go back, and it didn't change anything in our New York trip. So yes, this is how you can have a custom widget that's built and completely reusable based on the data that you're storing in Firebase. All right, one quick thing before we go. If you haven't already gotten a custom domain name for your app or project, head on over to Namecheap, and you can get some really good deals right now on all the products they offer, especially domain names. You can see their domains right now are up to 95% off. If you're interested in a .com, you get it for less than $7 a year, as well as all these other offers that they have. Getting that custom domain or custom hosting is very easy through Namecheap. It's always what I use. So use the link down below. It helps support the channel. All right. Hope you enjoyed this video. Ciao for now.